We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 79 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swadling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalist. Mike, how are you?
Feeling festive, Dan.
Excellent. Have you had a peaceful Christmas?
A joyous and merry one.
Splendid. Well, we are delighted to be joined today by, and I do need to take a deep breath before I try to go through all this, by financial writer, author, singer-songwriter, comedian, voiceover artist, TV presenter and small state enthusiast, Dominic Frisby. Dominic, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and what an honour it is to finally be speaking to the Croydon Constitutionalists. I feel like one of my dreams is complete.
Well, it is a magical time of year, Dominic, so Santa Claus has obviously brought you... You've obviously been a good boy this year. So as things have quietened down a little bit over the festive season, we thought we would have a chat with Dominic about his thoughts on the state we are in and discuss some of his recent projects. So Dominic, back in 2013, you wrote The Case for Small Government in a book called Life After the State.
I did, yes.
What are your thoughts on how things have changed since then, and after this year's attempt, shall we say, by Liz Truss to push back a little bit on the encroachment of the state? How do you think things are going?
Well, things are going very badly indeed, and we're in a much worse position than we were in 2013, and we weren't in a good position then. And, you know, I'm just looking at the world around me, or not even the world around me, you know, the England around me, but you could expand this and make it the entire, you know, Western Europe or even North America as well. But if you look at, you know, what the last few weeks have brought us, we have out of control inflation. So whatever the Bank of England's doing isn't working. We have an unelected leader. And we have a Conservative Party that's just totally fallen apart. And you could really say a parliament that's not functioning because nothing's changing. We have, you know, the trains on strike. We have the NHS that's not giving basic services to its customers. We got the Royal Mail on strike. We have an education system that is more of an indoctrination system than it is an education system. It's become about, you know, ideology takes precedent over truth or fact. And, you know, I can go on. These are all things we know. But if you look at every single one of those things that I just mentioned, they are all things that are either state or government run or were at some point state or government run to the point at which now they've still got that state mentality. I'm thinking of the Royal Mail when I say that. I know it's a private company, and you know, when I grew up, I'm 53. When I grew up in the 70s, you know, it's partly being a kid. Oh, the one I didn't mention was the police, the state of the police, and you know, we pay 50% tax, and one of the basic requirements of government is defend our borders. And, you know, we've got I gather that migration last year was 1 million people. 1 million people. I know 500,000 left, but 1 million people. That means that 1 in every 65 people that you meet only came to this country last year.
When we were locked down.
Well, no, it was the year after the lockdown. And to be fair to that number, one of the reasons that migration was so high is because of the increased movement of people after the lockdown. But even so, it's just enormous. And so it's hard to find a government body that is actually working. And yet, I'm not sure even one exists. Maybe the army. The one that made me laugh this week was how the airports are all suddenly functioning well now. Border Force have gone on strike. So, you know, you look at that, and then the standard argument is, oh, well, they're all rubbish because we're not spending enough money. And I would just go, no, they're rubbish because when the state runs something and profit isn't the main motive, it inevitably becomes rubbish because all the incentives are all wrong, and you know, profit has become this evil word, and it's totally misunderstood and smeared and all the rest of it. But you know, it was not this bad in 2012, 2013 when I wrote Life After the State. It's just got worse, and it's not. You know, I'm a hard money bug, and we pray that, you know, one of the things that people believe in sound money goes that they will just destroy the currency, and once the currency is destroyed you have to go back to gold, and then inevitably once you use gold or Bitcoin or whatever it is, some form of money that government can't print, then the rules are the same for government as they are for everything else, and their belt is tightened, and so we'll go back to something better. But you know, they've been printing money since 1914, and it just sort of gets incrementally worse. It never implodes. It just sort of gets increment. It's like a huge boiling frog thing. But anyway, so the answer to your first question is no, they haven't got better.
So you also wrote Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future, about the history of taxation. And it's fair to say you're a fan of the land value tax. Well, you may have heard that our council in Croydon, like a few others, has declared what is de facto bankruptcy recently. So we wanted to ask your thoughts on how local councils should be funded.
Well, one of the observations I made in Daylight Robbery, and by the way, you design a society by the way that you tax it. And if you're looking for patient zero is the trope in a zombie film where the virus originated. And if you're looking for patient zero, how we fix broken Britain, well, the answer is to just throw away the tax system and start again. And at the moment we have, you know, huge income tax, and we don't tax assets hardly at all unless there's a sale. We tax the dividends on assets, but we don't tax assets unless there's a sale. And there's a capital gain to be taxed. And if you're a man or a woman starting out with nothing, all you have is your labour, and we tax it relentlessly and heavily. And when you tax labour and you don't tax capital, it's inevitable that society will become imbalanced in favour of capital. So that's, you know, the cause of the inequality gap is our tax system. And tax keeps growing. And if I were to ask you what the most expensive thing you ever buy, or I'll ask you, what's the most expensive thing you ever buy in your life?
So I might have heard you say this before,
Okay,
but it's government, of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, people always say a house, but it's not. It's your government, and over 50% of everything you ever earn will be taken from you in taxes over the course of your life, and more if you include the inflation tax. But, so, tax has grown, and it keeps growing. The tax system gets ever bigger and ever more complicated, and as a result government keeps expanding. But what has also happened, especially in the UK, but it also has happened in America, what is the collection of taxes used to be local. Many more taxes were collected locally, whereas now local taxes have actually gone down over the last, say, 100 years, especially in America. In 100 years ago in the States, 50% of revenue was collected locally and 50% was collected at the federal level. But here in the UK, you know, I pay on this house, I don't know what it is, 1,500 quid, say, in council tax a year. So, and I pay, you know, a heck of a lot more than that in federal taxes, income taxes, VAT and all the other taxes I pay. So a much smaller level of taxes collected locally. And one of the reasons why the amount of tax that's collected locally has come down is that it's hard to collect tax locally because there is more accountability. The local person can say to the person who's collecting the taxes, I've seen how you spent your money, and you spent your money on X, Y and Z, and I don't agree with that. It's one of the reasons why Scandinavia works so well relative to the rest of Europe, is that much more taxes are collected locally. So even though they pay high level of taxes, there's much more accountability because they can see what is happening with their tax money. Whereas here it's collected remotely, you have no contact with the person that collects the tax, they have very little accountability, and there's vast amounts of waste, and services aren't very good. So that's an interesting dynamic, is this movement away from local taxes to centralised taxes. Local government should be funded by local taxes, is the short answer. One of the reasons local taxes are hard to collect is because people have already paid tax at the central level, at the federal level. So they're less inclined to pay large amounts of tax. The other reason is that your income tax, for example, or your VAT is deducted at source. You never actually receive the money. It's deducted and you're not given any choice. Whereas council tax, you can at least refuse to pay it. You have to go to court and all the rest of it, but you have that option. And that's why one of the reasons why Thatcher's community charge poll tax was such a disaster is because all the left-wing activists told everyone not to pay their poll taxes, and because those taxes weren't deducted at source, they proved very hard to collect, and then the whole thing spiraled from there. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to, overthrow the state is we don't have that ability to withhold tax money, which, if you go to a restaurant, you get rubbish service, you can not pay the bill. And I think the same should apply at the government level. If you get a rubbish service, then you should be able to withhold payment. But I'm afraid we are weakened as citizens and we don't have that option.
Absolutely.
I mean, certainly the block grant that councils get is now the biggest part of the budget. So as you say, there's been that more centralisation of where the income, where the tax is going, and where it's going.
What percentage of council revenue comes from central government, and what percentage comes from council tax?
I don't know, but I know it's the majority.
The majority comes from central
Definitely
government.
comes from central government now.
And certainly in Croydon's bankruptcy, that was a big feature of the council saying, we're not getting enough from central government, so we're going to spend what we want, what we think's right, and blame the government for not sending us the money. So what happened?
Why can't, if Croydon was a company, it would now just disappear. The people who own the debt would have their whatever, they get their pennies on the dollar, so to speak, pennies on the pound, and we could start again. But you can't do that with government.
You can't, and of course, certainly one of the enduring problems for someone like Croydon is they already know they're going to be bankrupt next year because they know they won't bring in enough revenue for their mandated spending and their ideal spending. So you, and this will be true of any local authority, but
is Croydon the worst in the country?
I think that's probably is, yes. I mean, it's hard to say there's an absolute measure, but it probably is.
Yeah.
But no, that's
like
exactly
Croydon, you'd think it would be like,
there's as a borough, it's kind of strange in that it's a bit of everywhere. If you're in the south of the borough, you're at the top of the North Downs, and you're in a nice sort of country area. It's a suburban, but a sort of country type area. And the north of the borough is very much, inner city kind of living area, big area. So there's on quite a few things they're seen as being a relatively prosperous borough, but actually it's not always. And in other things, it's seen as being fairly, it's given subsidies because it's because of it's a relatively poor borough in parts, but that's actually not right for the whole borough. So I think there's some problems of being an outer London borough. You're neither one thing or the other. And I'm making excuses that, in essence, there was a cabal of people that brought the borough down by misspending. I mean, that's that's really what went wrong.
And what were they spending the money? Were they nicking the money, or was it spending money on pet projects?
Pet projects, because I don't want to libel anyone, slander perhaps, but also it's
they won't be listening.
Yes, it was the capital to revenue mishandling. Selling off land so that they could build on that land and take dividends and spend it as revenue.
What's the demography of Croydon?
It's 50-50 kind of English, non-English, sorry,
White English.
white English to mixed race or whatever, a bang, I think, whatever the word is. I think it's probably quite a young borough.
I know a lot of people move there because the flats are cheap.
Yeah, but it's there's. Of course, all of those things don't for Croydon Central. Yeah, all of those things don't really affect council income. Back to your earlier point, actually, what the borough's like. So back in the day, Croydon made a lot of money by being the back office to the city. So lots of banking and insurance and general finance went up in new skyscrapers in Croydon. And all those back office jobs went out of the City of London, came to places like Croydon. Croydon boomed. Croydon ceased to gain the benefit of those taxes because, as you say, taxes are now collected centrally, not locally. So almost regardless of what the council did, and the council almost only has one lever, which is spending. And in this case, they spent to great aplomb. But they never had a lever of taking that money in, or indeed a punishment by doing things that cause problems with taking the money in.
And how much the council tax would council tax be on a 3-bed house in Croydon, 4-bed house?
I think they're the second highest in London, and I'd struggle to say what that amount is.
Okay.
It would vary very much depending upon where you are in the borough. Very much so. So a 3-bedroom house in New Addington would be nowhere near the price of a 3-bedroom house in sort of South Croydon or some area like that. It's very... And Croydon, broadly speaking, as Mike said, the north is one thing, the south is something else, and the middle bit is a bit of both, really. So this was one of the issues, which is... when the council was run on the basis of you have, I think, 70 councillors, and whoever gets the most councillors is in charge, Labour and the Conservatives would only fight over a handful of wards because everybody knew that these wards would go Conservative and these wards would go Labour. So there was very little interest in getting votes from somebody in a different part, what have you, whereas with the elected mayor, that was sort of changed. So that, in fact, it's quite
Who's
strange.
the mayor?
Jason
Perry, yeah.
Conservative.
So he's a Conservative, but it's
Popular?
interesting.
He was elected in May. I think. I don't think he's not a flashy name or person. I think he'd admit that himself. What happened in May was the Conservative vote turned out as it normally would, and the Labour vote stayed at home.
Why?
Because Labour bankrupt Croydon. I think there's people who would never vote Conservative, didn't vote Labour.
I gotcha.
And
which is what's going to happen in the next election, in the general election.
In reverse, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you saw that. You saw that generally in the councillor polling as well. So you mentioned Gavin Barwell being the MP. Croydon had 3 seats, or has 3 seats. Sorry, one's very Labour, one's very Conservative, and one's the marginal seat.
Okay. And Barwell had the marginal.
Barwell had the marginal seat, and and in the council elections, the Labour seat and the council wards in that Labour seat all remain Labour, give or take. There was a couple of changes, but pretty much all remain Labour. None of them went Conservative. But what you noticed, they all got elected on very, very much reduced majorities.
Okay.
But of course, when you're getting 70% of the vote, to only get 55% is not really a problem.
Yeah, and Barwell, one of Britain's many housing ministers, wasn't he, at one point?
Indeed, yes.
As people like to point out whenever possible.
Yes.
Oh, do they? Sorry.
Yes. No. They do, because of the housing issues that we've had in Croydon. And Barwell was also a big supporter of the Westfield shopping centre, which was supposed to be the future of central Croydon, and I'm still waiting for it. Yeah. In fact, yeah, it's not going to happen.
There's a lot of crime in Croydon.
Do you know, funnily enough, again, it's one of those things. Central Croydon, a reasonable
I've seen
amount.
lots of videos of knife crime in South Croydon, in North Croydon.
Yes, exactly. So it's all about areas. There's parts of the borough that are there's a lot of problems, and there's parts of the borough that, like where I live, the foxes are a bit of a problem.
Okay.
But that's 5 miles away from where there's quite a lot of street crime. Well, there has been quite a lot of street crime, and that is, but it's it's.
Do you ever see
it's an-
private security vehicles driving around?
No, I in the areas that might have them don't need them, and the areas that need them probably wouldn't be able to afford. Or there's not a nice estate that might buy them or anything like that. There's. It is very. There's a whole, where my family grew up, an area of Thornton Heath. There's a lot of challenges in that area. There's quite a lot of, knife crime in that area. It's very hard to see what the thing is that's changing there or likely to change there, until you tackle the crime, until I don't know what. That's when I was a lad, that was a reasonable area. When my parents grew up there, when my mum grew up there, it was quite a nice area. Apart from the Luftwaffe, it was quite a nice area.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where statistically there's quite high crime in certain areas, but I don't ever feel not safe. And I live sort of centrally, but I don't ever feel not safe. Now, if I was 16, maybe, and was hanging around certain bus stations in West Croydon, maybe I'd feel differently about that.
If you weren't so old that they ignore you, you might feel differently.
Exactly. I'm not part of any of these gangs or what have you. So yeah, but yeah, Croydon's got its challenges, and we'll see what the new mayor can do in due course. We know he's actually declared bankruptcy again, effectively, on the basis that they won't be able to balance the budget, which they obviously have to announce early in the new year, ahead of the new financial year. And they've said, we ain't got the money to do what we
There's so many
absolutely
parallels
need
between
to
this
do.
is what happened in the 80s with Thatcher. There's so many parallels between now and the 70s, 80s culture war. Anyway,
Indeed. Well, saying as to why Croydon is a kind of declared bankruptcy again on the basis that it won't be able to put its budget together. The reason for that really is that it has to spend money on certain things. It's got no choice, and wherever the money comes from, it does have to do that. Dominic, what would you like to see a change in local government in particular in terms of what they spend money on or what they need to spend money on?
well, I'm here in Lewisham up the road, and Lewisham is, in my head it was always loony left, and government spending very red. I think it was like over 70% Remain, might have been 75. It was one of the most Remainy boroughs, councils. But I pay my, whatever it is, 1,500 quid a year council tax, and that is literally the only dealing I have with the council, and I'm quite grateful. I sort of see it as like you pay 1,500 quid and you don't need to do anything else, and we won't bother you and you don't bother us. And there's no parking restrictions in the street outside. I'm amazed by that. I used to live in Lambeth, and Lambeth used to charge, Brixton would be charging the same rates as Westminster, and you'd be like, and this is 20 years ago, before Brixton was as cool as it is now, and I'd be like, how can you charge the same rates to park in Brixton that you're charging in Soho or somewhere? But they do, and you're stuck. And so I've always been grateful to Lewisham Council that it's not done that. So anyone who wants to drive to my house, as you've just come today, you can just park outside. I presume you come by car, but if you
Got the train, but yeah.
oh, you got the train, but if you'd come by car, you could have just parked outside and no problem. And it's like being in the 1970s. And so I like Lewisham for that. Why else have I had to contact? I go into Lewisham town centre itself, and it's the world has ended. It is the edge of the world. It's one of the most grim. Going into Lewisham town centre must be the grimmest place in history.
But please feel free to come to Croydon Town.
Well, I'm going to say, I realise I'm talking to Croydon. Like, Lewisham's probably Babylon to you guys, but I mean, it's just the buildings are horrible. It's just so aggressive. It's just not got any charm, and it's just, you know, you could where else nearby. You know, Lewisham, Greenwich is much nicer. Peckham's much nicer. Least Peckham's got some nice old buildings. Brixton's nicer. You know, Lewisham is just. There's another comedian called Matt Ford, and we went to watch a boxing fight at the O2 Centre one time. It was David Hay against Tony Bellew. And for some reason, after the fight, we ended up in Lewisham Town Centre having fried chicken. And I was just like, how have we ended up here? And it was just awful. But there's a lot, like, and there's so many buildings have gone up in Lewisham. And you look at Lewisham, some of the old buildings, Lewisham before it was bombed, you know, because they sacrificed this part of London, southeast London, to save central London in the war. They did something that tricked the German bombers, so that they thought when they bombed southeast, I mean, obviously they kind of come into east and southeast London before they get to central London anyway. But the bombers thought they were bombing central London, they were bombing southeast London, so it got bombed to hell. There's beautiful big old houses, particularly in that section between sort of Brockley and Lewisham. Huge, you know, you could be in Notting Hill or somewhere. Lovely, lovely houses. And then everywhere they got bombed, they just built something horrible. And then they pulled that down, and now they're building a load of new stuff that's equally horrible. And it's awful. And, you know, society starts with the architecture, I guess. And if you build ugly buildings, you know, Kevin MacLeod has documented this quite repeatedly. People behave badly when they are not if they're in an ugly place. And they don't, if somewhere is beautiful, then they behave better. But, you know, everything they've erected in Lewisham, beauty hasn't been a criterion. But anyway, I'm whittering on. I'm not saying I'm an admirer of Lewisham Council, but I have zero dealings with them. I don't need to get the parking permit. Like, they sometimes collect the rubbish. Fortunately, I don't create enough rubbish for them to be at worst. The roads are crap, but every now and then somebody, I mean, we've got crap internet here. I'd be grateful for broadband, but I don't think that's a Lewisham proper broadband, but I don't think it's a Lewisham thing necessarily. The roads are pretty bad, but, you know, they're no worse than anywhere else in London. And what else does Lewisham do? I don't even know. The schools are terrible, but yeah,
Mate, that's an educational block grant.
Okay.
I mean, they do. Councils are involved in running the schools, but it's an education block.
Okay, so what else do they do apart from collect the rubbish and issue parking permits?
Yeah.
The tennis courts are really good. I like tennis, and the tennis courts are really good in the parks. The parks, you know, Ladywell Fields is a nice park. Hilly Fields is a nice park. The parks are good. But what else do they spend the money on? I don't know what else they do. But so, yeah, I give them their money, and we have no interaction, and I'm quite happy like that. If I had to do bureaucracy on their internet, I wouldn't feel quite the same way. You know what I mean? Like paperwork on the website, whatever.
Oh, yeah. Try getting your bins collected in Croydon. It's quite troublesome when
they advertised that they were going to collect all the rubbish yesterday, right, and nobody came. But somebody came today and did the green bins, and I guess that I've got to be glad with what I've got.
I keep seeing it with our council. It's been all over Facebook that they've not collected the bins when they said they would this week. And you know, I'm in the fortunate position whereby I've got bigger bins than I need. So if it goes this week or next week, I don't care. But it appears that everything they've said they would do, they've done the opposite. But
yeah,
you say, if it doesn't affect you personally, it's not something I choose to trouble myself too much with.
What else does the council do that I've left out? Social
services is a big part, which, you know, fortunately, I suspect none of us have much interaction with. But certainly on and off it's changed, to use the example of Croydon, at some point, and this is one of the problems of bankruptcy, where it's not just a when the council spent money, the Labour Council particularly has overspent money, and it means they're not spending money on things like social services, where you are literally leaving the most vulnerable at risk. And that's that's the Labour Party. I just want to make that point. But that kind of thing. As I say, fortunately, I'm sure none of us need to worry about that. But that is an important part. But
there's plenty of, there's plenty. I don't know how much crime is their responsibility, but there's a celebrity lady who hangs around the end of my street, and she's like been on the telly and stuff. She's a famous beggar. And I don't know what she's addicted to, but she's addicted to something. And, I've lived here 7 years. She's probably asked me 2 or 3 times a week for money. And you're like, surely you know me by now. Yeah. And she still haven't got a clue who I am. But I don't know what the council are doing for her, but she's out hustling almost every day of the week. But I don't know I don't know how good a job they do on social services, but I doubt very good.
Well, you first heard of us via Tam Laird of the Scottish Libertarians.
Yeah.
So we've got the Free Speech Union these days. We've got Reform UK, Reclaim, Together.
Yeah.
Got your Comedy Unleashed, and a plethora of pro-freedom parties and organisations. What are your thoughts on how we are set to fight the battle for liberty in this country?
Oh, I'm sorry to be so gloomy, but I mean, there's a real positive alliance, and they're really fighting back. And I think the Free Speech Union, in particular, does an amazing job. It helped a friend out the other day, and he was in big problems. But I just think, what the majority. I think the majority of people, certainly in England and probably across the UK, generally want less state, more individual responsibility. They don't mind some migration, but nothing on quite the levels that we're at. And, they're happy to pay a certain amount of that. They expect a reasonable service in return, and they don't want to have their money spent on stupid pet projects or lining or on corruption. And I just think that's the majority view. A bit less state, lower taxes, and more individual responsibility. And the Tories are supposed to stand for that, and they've had 12 years, and they've delivered the opposite. And if the Tories can't deliver it, what hope do we have? And we have the two-party system, and so I guess there's an outside chance that the Tories could implode, but they won't. They'll just get a new leader, and they'll probably have 4 or 8 years of Labour, and then we'll get 4 or 8 years of Tories, and they'll all be as bad as each other. In fact, in a funny kind of way, I almost think we'd be better off with Labour, because the bizarre thing with the Tories, they were so scared of the opposition, they just pandered to them and did everything the opposition would have done, and maybe the same will happen with Labour. So, and with people constantly holding them to account, maybe they will lower taxes, but I doubt it. But I just don't think political change is possible. So if that's what you're referring to, there will be lots of people talking about it and dreaming about it, but the citizen is not armed and the government is, so there's a power imbalance there. The taxes, you don't even have the power to withhold taxes, so you don't have that power. And voting changes nothing. Representative democracy doesn't work. You're choosing between Labour and Tory. I mean, what's the difference? And you get Social Democrat whichever way you vote, and the blob stays the same. And so, the only vote that meant anything was Brexit. That was handled by a Conservative Party that campaigned for Remain, didn't understand it, didn't believe in it, couldn't see the opportunity that it was, or if they did see it as an opportunity, they chose to turn a blind eye to it. And they made a mess of it, and they haven't owned it. And so... yeah, I'm afraid I'm not very positive. Despite all these noble people, everyone trying to do their little bit, and I'll carry on trying to do my little bit and making the argument and so on. But I think we're all better off moving to Ancapistan. It was Tam who told me that term, Ancapistan, and it made me laugh a lot. I've done a song about it that's coming out in the next few days.
Oh, splendid.
Do you think? I mean, there's a few things there. There's lots too many things, but things like Comedy Unleashed, I would say like 2 or 3 years ago, you had what I would describe as sort of the mock the week BBC worldview, and not a lot else in comedy. Whereas names like yourself and I don't know, Jeff Norcott, Simon Evans.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a kind of a wider grouping, which you've obviously been at the forefront of pushing. It's a small step in the right direction, perhaps, but at least it's a step.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's true. That's true, but yeah, and Peter Thiel wrote a very good essay in 2008 called "The Education of a Libertarian," and he argued that you can't achieve political change through politics. You have to do it through new frontiers, and he argued that you achieve it through new technologies, but also new frontiers such as space or cyberspace or seasteading or wherever it is. So you go and colonize places that haven't previously been colonized. And I guess, comedy and the spoken word and the argument is in itself a new frontier. So, yeah, I love it. I support it. I'm grateful for the platform that it's given me. And I think I've more than done my bit in return and made people laugh and so on. But I still don't think politics changes.
So do you think it's if it's not about specific political parties, Conservative or Labour,
It's the system.
is it? Do you think we can achieve gradual? I'm going to use the word progress, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Through being more involved, perhaps in what you used to call civil society. So that could be, the arts, cultural matters, such as, your comedy stuff and obviously your music, but also getting involved in more local activities, because I think there's perhaps a tendency amongst, particularly those that absolutely declare themselves to be libertarians, to say, I'm an individual, please don't tax me sort of thing, but, not wanting to get too involved in local activities, whereas other people perhaps get more involved and then have more of an impact. Do you think there's any value in getting more involved in local organisations that are not necessarily blatantly political?
I think there's a lot of value in doing all those things, if only because you meet like-minded people, and you're happier when you're with like-minded people. And the more people do, the more stuff is likely to change. And just because I think things aren't going to change doesn't mean they won't. And just because I'm being negative, even though I'm not very positive about how much can change, I'll still go on doing the things that I do, and everyone else should do the same. And you can rest your bottom dollar that if you do something, things are more likely to change than if you do nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, we've talked a little bit about politics, but your great passion at the moment has been Kisses on a Postcard and musical. That was released this past year. Can you tell our listeners a bit about it and what the reception's been like?
Well, Kisses on a Postcard was something my dad wrote, which describes his time as an evacuee. He was evacuated from Deptford up the road. Well, actually, he was evacuated from Welling up the road, but he made it Deptford in the story because nobody knows where Welling is, and Deptford's sort of core of southeast London. So he was evacuated from there to Cornwall to escape the bombs during the Battle of Britain, and he was 7 and his brother Jack was 11, and along with 4 million other kids around the country, they were sent from the cities, away from their families, away from their parents, to go and live with a bunch of complete strangers. And many people had horrible experiences. My dad happened to have had a very happy one. And this is a musical all about that story. And he made it, and then he died he wrote it, and then he died. And he wrote the story, and somebody else wrote the music, and then that person who wrote the music died, and then some other people came in to write the music. It was just wasn't quite finished. And then Dad died in 2020, and I was just sat there in the lockdown, and I'm clearing out stuff. I found the script and the CD, and it was just staring at me. So all through the lockdown, I rewrote some of the music with my colleague, who it turned out his parents had been evacuated from East London down to Cornwall, so we had that shared thing, and we produced this musical called Kisses on a Postcard, which I think is as good a musical as Oliver or The Sound of Music or any of those great musicals with kids. It's got great songs, it's a powerful story, it makes you laugh, it makes you cry, and it's about an extraordinary episode in British history. I say British, I think people were evacuated from Scottish cities, but yeah, an extraordinary moment in British history. And it's a very, very English story. I say English and Welsh because the family that took them in were Welsh, and they were based, even though they were based down in Cornwall. I've produced it, but it's a new format, because when you think of musicals, you normally think of going to the cinema and watching one in the cinema or watching one on stage. It's, even though musicals are audio, they're not an audio thing, whereas this is an audio only musical that we've produced, and it's cost me an absolute fortune. We've got a brilliant cast, we've got an orchestra of 15, it was recorded in Abbey Road, you know, all these amazing things, but it's been hard to get people to listen. But when they do listen, the emails I get are incredible. You know, people just how moved they were by the whole thing. And so it's what's called is a slow burner. I produced it, I put it up there, and then nobody was interested, so I just left it for 6 months, and then I did a bit of PR over the last couple of months, did a few podcasts, and then suddenly people started listening to it, and now the thing's sort of bubbling a little bit. But yeah, it's free, so if anyone's listening, Kisses on a Postcard, just get it via Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcast app is. And if you're old school, you can buy a CD from kissesonapostcard.com. But you know, it's 4.5 hours long. It's like an audio book. It's in like half-hour episodes, and it is the best thing probably that I've ever done in my life, and it'll probably be the best thing I ever do in my life, and it's become a life's mission to get this thing on, and I'm very proud of it, and I hope your listeners listen to it, and I won't say any more than that.
No, I'd say, to echo some of that though, I'm perhaps not one of nature's most obvious musical watchers or listeners, and I've listened to it, and it is incredibly engaging, you know, and I'll be honest, perhaps more so than I expected, just because I didn't think it would be my genre, but it really is good, and it's a great story. There's a great bit of history as well, which is nice to see, and of course it ties in for me. Like millions of others, my mum was evacuated from Thornton Heath, to dodge the Luftwaffe I mentioned earlier.
Where was she? Where was she?
She was at various times in Guildford and South Wales, and there was a period near Red Hill. Okay. So some of it not far and some of it quite a long way. And my dad up in High Wycombe had evacuees stay with him, separately, with his family. And it's funny, you've got this published, but it's a bit of history you don't hear a lot about. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on maybe why that is. It's not a well-covered
Well, apparently
story.
they do teach the story of the evacuees in the schools, but I only learnt about it from my dad. I never learnt about it when I was at school. And it's the biggest mass movement of people in our country's history. It's just an amazing story, and it had incredible effects on families around the country, good and bad. And, to mobilise that many people then, and the idea of, just sticking your kids on a train with a label with their name on, a gas mask and some sandwiches, and not knowing where they're going, who'd be taking them in, how long they'd be gone for, whether you'd ever see them again. There were kids who were put on the train, they never saw their parents again. And similarly, there were parents who never saw their kids again. So, goodness, and I don't know if that could happen today. Because we're so much less unified as a country than we were then. Trust in the state's totally gone, and there's the whole. We were much more monocultural in those days, and so there was more trust between people, whereas now we're much more multicultural, and so you've got different people from different cultures taking different kids if that were to happen now, and sometimes some people would be happy to do it and other people wouldn't, and it's just it's an incredible story, and this is an incredible story anyway, but the episode is incredible as well.
I think the only sort of time, and I could be wrong about this, that I've ever seen anything to do with evacuees in film or what have you was it Bed Knobs and Broomsticks?
Yes, Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, and also there was a film called Hope and Glory. It was quite big
Yes.
when it was probably late 80s, mid to late 80s, and there was another film called I've forgotten what it was called. It'll come back to me. There was another story, but this is better than all of them.
It's funny you mentioned about whether it would happen now, and partly there's a bit in the story that really struck me as how things have changed over time, and even changed from our childhoods. Was where the boys got a knife.
Oh, yeah.
And now when I was a kid, I was a scout and a cub, and we had knives, we had axes, we had saws, and almost by the time you were of an age where you were out with lads, at late teens or what have you, where we talked about knife crime earlier. There's a lot of knife crime. I was completely bored of things like that. If someone got out a knife or an axe, to me that meant I would be making kindling or fashioning a peg or something like that. And obviously that's something that was true from our childhood to back to the war, and has completely changed today. And
this was a miniature. That's certainly true. And the kids were literally, they would open the door. There was no cars, and so they'd just be sent to go out in the woods to play. One of them died. I didn't actually tell that story in the show, but one of Dad's friends died in the river. He got caught.
Right, okay.
We made it. I adapted that bit a little bit, so one of them got caught in the river, but he got saved. But in his actual life, one of the kids just drowned in the river.
Wow.
And they'd be sent off to the woods. They were all fighting each other all the time. They were in fights. But Dad says, I don't know how bad the fights were, and he bought a miniature sheath knife, but that would have been for, as you say, chopping bits of wood, making a fire, just, boys having adventures in the woods kind of stuff. It would not have been these huge, great machete, technologically advanced, hardened steel, knives that they have now. And I imagine the knife would have just been a few inches long and probably not that sharp. And they had much fewer clothes as well. They didn't have warm clothes like we have today, and the boys would just be in their shorts. Right up until probably they were 13 or 14, they would have just been in shorts, one pair of boots, and summer or winter, but yeah, I mean, Dad, you get a sense of the smells and the, they went on a big mission to steal the neighbours' gooseberries, was one big episode in the show, and now we just go out in the sweet shop.
So, with that in mind, what perhaps was your favourite part of the story? Is there anything that you think captures the essence of your father or indeed your uncle?
Well, we were lost both my uncle and my dad in the last few years, but maybe I'll tell you one little story from the show, and which is why it's called Kisses on a Postcard. And forgive me if I start crying, but it always makes me cry. But then when I've told this story and we come to the end of the show, maybe I'll give you one song and just you can play the show out on that one song, because if nothing else, the music's beautiful. But the reason it's called Kisses on a Postcard is so we're in 1940 and the last soldiers are just coming back from Dunkirk, the evacuation of Dunkirk, and they know that Germany's about to bomb Britain, the Battle of Britain's about to begin. And so the decision has been taken that they're going to evacuate all the kids from the cities to the countryside. And we've already mentioned this, how difficult this must have been for parents. They didn't know where they were going, how long they'd be going for, who'd be taking them in, nothing. And Dad's mum, my grandmother, turned it into a huge adventure for them. And so on the day they were saying goodbye, and they've got the gas mask around their neck and their sandwiches and their change of clothes, and she's about to walk them down to the station and stick them on the train, she gives them a postcard. And it says on the postcard, "Dear Mum and Dad, arrive safe and well, love Jack and Terry." And she turns, in order to make it into an adventure for them, she gave them this secret code that only they would know about. And she goes, "You know how to write kisses?" And they say, "Yeah," with a cross. And she says, "You write the address of wherever you go, wherever you end up, you stay together. And when you get there, and they're going, where, and she's going, there, wherever it is, you write the address of where you end up. You put 1 kiss if it's horrible, you put 2 kisses if it's okay, and you put 3 kisses if it's nice. So that's the code, 1, 2 or 3 kisses. And that way Mum would know. And if it's horrible, she'd come straight there and get them. And if it was nice, then fine. So anyway, they walk down to the station. They've got their postcard, their pre-written postcard. They're put on a train. The train goes all the way across London, then all the way out through Surrey, Wiltshire, across the south of England. And it ends up in Liskeard in Cornwall, a tiny village in Cornwall. They're taken off the train. They're all put in buses. The buses fan out into various little villages close to Liskeard. And Dad and about 50 of his mates from school end up in the village hall in this tiny village called Dobwalls, and they're just herded into the middle of the village hall. Locals have all got these strange Cornish accents. Nobody's heard a Cornish accent before. They're all dressed strangely. Even the smell, you know, the country air, everything smells different. The sights, the sounds, the smells, and they're herded into the village hall, and then the locals have to come and pick them out of the village hall like cattle. Dad used to call it the cattle market. And the expression was, I'll take that one there. That became the expression across the country. I'll have that one there. And people would come up to Dad and say, I'll have him. And he'd say, I have to be with my brother. And eventually they were picked out by this Welsh couple he was now a plate layer on the Great Western Railway. He'd been a soldier in World War One. And he was the only soldier that came back to his village. And because of the way they looked at his wife, everyone in the village, they ended up having to leave the village. Imagine that, being the only young man who comes back to your village. Anyway, he was a massive socialist in that sort of old school. Ernest Bevin was a real hero of his, you know, hated Tories, hated Churchill, he was a libertarian, but he didn't know it. Socialist libertarian, you know, that left-wing libertarian, Corbyn. But, you know, one of the lines he said is, never, 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 never trust your leaders. Churchill's a hero, Montgomery's a hero, where's our son Gwyn? Their son Gwyn died in action. But anyway, Dad and his brother are picked out by this couple. They're taken back to their house. It's a tiny little railway cottage. There's a railway line at the end of their cottage because he worked on the railway, so he was given one of the railway cottages. There's no electricity, only oil lamps. There's a cat asleep by the fire. There's a canary in a cage. They don't have their own bed. They've got a top and tail. They've got this son Gwyn, who's this funny character, hasn't died yet. There's a pig outside, asleep in the backyard. Chickens outside their door. They've got the railway, the woods to explore, rivers to dam, you know, the hills to climb, all of it. And Dad and his brother thought they died and gone to heaven. They absolutely liked it. And so at the end of the first night, they're on their own in the bedroom with a candlelight, and they have to decide how many kisses to put on the postcard. And in the end, they ringed the card with kisses. They just circled the whole postcard with kisses and sent it home the next day. And so that's why it's called Kisses on a Postcard. But the story describes the whole of World War II, from the evacuation of Dunkirk to the turning point with Rommel, the arrival of the American soldiers, and eventually the victory. But through the eyes of this little Cornish village and the ups and downs of the Cornish village. So the village gets bombed at one point. Plymouth gets bombed and they were caught in Plymouth. There's all the goings on between the Vackies and the local kids, the arrival of the American soldiers. The regiment that was billeted on this village was all a bunch of black guys from Louisiana. It was one of the few black regiments, and then one of the local girls gets pregnant and all this stuff. So it's just an amazing story. And I'm just thinking which song to play you. I'm going to play you this song is the song that is played. I mentioned before when they go and invade the next door neighbour, the old lady who next door, they go and raid her gooseberry bushes. And then they get caught and they have to go and apologise and offer to help her out. And this is an old folk song that we adapted that's sung about the old lady who lives next door. And it's sung by a girl called Daisy Mortimer, who is from just up the road in Dulwich. And she was only 17 when she sings it. And I think you'll agree, she's got quite some voice. And it's an old folk song called There Was an Old Lady, All Skin and Bone.
There was a lady, all skin and bone. She lived in a cottage